I'm the director for Common Knowledge Trust. We're a New Zealand NGO, and we house all of the Birthing Better Childbirth online birthing classes. The Birthing Better skills were developed by hundreds of fathers and mothers in the early 1970s. And I want to tell you that in my lifetime, there has been a change in how we tell birth stories. And this is what I want to talk to you today about. So, what I want to first talk to you today about is how we're telling birth stories now and have been pretty much since the mid 1980s. And then I want to go back and tell you what my generation of women and men told as their birth stories and how you can change what your children tell when they have babies. So, what are the three elements that you tell or that you hear in a birth story? The first element is always, when did the birth start? So that can sound like, my water broke at 11 p.m. I went to the hospital at 3 in the morning. They broke my water bag at 7. I was induced at 11. I gave birth at 4:15 the next morning. Or it can sound like this. I thought I was having a little bit of cramping in the afternoon, but it went away at night. Then my contractions picked up again in the morning. We called the midwife, we called the doula. They came to the house at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I gave birth at 11 p.m. So it's all about time. I got into the car, we drove to the hospital. We arrived at the hospital at noon. They prepped me for surgery. I didn't have the surgery till 6 p.m. and my baby was born at 7:30. So that's one element you hear in every birth story. It's a time frame of birth story. The next element you always hear is what they did or didn't do to me. It can be things, even during pregnancy, they wanted me to have more tests than I did, or they were rude to me, or I didn't like how they approached me. It can sound like, my husband was an idiot. He couldn't help me at all. Or the labor and delivery nurse was wonderful and she reassured me. Or my doctor was never there. Or they demanded that I have this or that. They imposed stuff. All of this is what they did or didn't do. My husband was wonderful. Whatever. It's all about what they did or didn't do to you. And that's often associated to birth plans, because the birth plans that became the norm in the mid 1980s was all about what you want or you don't want, with the belief that they have a responsibility to give you the birth that you want. That was always never going to work. And this has caused a lot of the shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and belief that they, particularly the medical profession, are really imposing inappropriate behaviors on you. And I'm going to do another video about the medical profession. When it comes to dismissing your partner or the person who's helping you, my midwife was great in pregnancy, and then during the birth, she sat in a corner and knitted, and I needed her to help me. Or my doula was fine, but she got between me and my husband. Or my doula was wonderful, or my midwife was wonderful, or my husband was wonderful. So it goes both ways. But when it's dismissive of the partner, this has a lifetime repercussion on many women. So if a partner doesn't have the ability to really participate with you in birth, then after the birth, often you'll push them away. And this is what happens because pregnancy and birth, it's not that they're normal life events, they're a continuation through life, and they impact us. So the third element, besides time and what they did and didn't do to me, was the experiences you had. I labored for days, or I had such a short labor I thought I was going to die, or I had terrible pain in my back, or I pushed for hours and hours. So you get this experience about what happened to you. I coped with the pain fine, and then I had an epidural. So, what happened to you is your personal experience. So, those basically are the three elements of birth stories that we have heard since the mid 1980s, which basically leads to someone listening to that birth story thinking, that's their birth story. That's not my birth story. I hope for a better one, or I wish for such a good one. But it doesn't give us the ability as women to each other, or even men to each other, to help each other birth. And that's what Birthing Better is all about. Birthing better families who develop these skills wanted to know how to birth. They wanted something that would help them birth their baby, no matter what the birth was, where they birthed, who was present, their personal circumstances, beliefs, or what happened to or around them. And that was skills. So let me just go back to when I gave birth in 1970, and that changed when I gave birth last in 1982. In the United States, maybe in Canada, our trust is in New Zealand. New Zealand had a different history. Australia, UK, Holland, Germany, all around the world in the 70s, childbirth was a country to country, and in the United States, state to state, conversation. By the mid 1980s, it was a global conversation. So in the United States, from the 60s to the mid 70s, there was, and I'm going to repeat this, a very high societal expectation that expectant families learn birth skills. So you need to understand there was a high societal expectation. And what does that mean? That means we told each other. And what did we tell each other? We told each other to go to the first ever childbirth preparation classes. And those were Lamaze and the Bradley method. And they were entirely skills based. We went to classes and we learned breathing techniques and relaxation techniques. Fathers were just coming in. We had no choices. By the 1980s, the societal message sort of was still go to childbirth preparation classes, but the classes now were information based because it had shifted to make a birth plan, make choices. So you went to classes, and if you learned any skills, they were very small and sort of hidden somewhere, but you spent a lot of time talking about the pros and cons of what were now called medical interventions. And then by the 90s and the 2000s, fewer and fewer women go to childbirth preparation classes. There is no longer a societal expectation. So in the 70s, the societal expectation was go to these first childbirth classes, which were all skills based, which meant in the United States, from the 60s to the 70s, multiple millions of expectant families learned birth skills. You have to get your head wrapped around that. Multiple millions of pregnant women in the early 1970s and their husbands or other learned birth and birth coaching skills. That meant that multiple millions of us went into the hospital primarily, and the hospital labor and delivery nurses and the obstetricians saw multiple millions of women and men using some form of birth and birth coaching skills from the 60s through the mid 1970s, which means the birth stories that we told were different. What did we tell? What did my generation of women and men tell about their birth stories? Primarily, we talked about the skills we used and whether they worked effectively. So we would talk about working together. We would talk about our breathing. We would talk about trying to relax. We didn't really talk about the time. To some degree, we did, because that was a personal experience. My water bag broke in the middle of the night, or my contractions lingered for days. So that was always part of the birth story in the 70s. What they didn't do to us was less defined because we went into hospitals where there were assessments, monitoring, and procedures. Those were called standards of care. They were called evidence-based practice. They were called guidelines to practice. They were not lumped into the one word called interventions, which you have been taught to believe are unnecessary and imposed on you. That's a different viewpoint. So when I gave birth in 1970, I didn't necessarily like it. I got shaved. I had an enema. I couldn't eat. I couldn't get up and walk. And, not but, and I used my birth skills alongside all of those things. What did that do to our society when multiple millions of us were using skills alongside assessments, monitoring, procedures during birth? It meant that we coped better. It meant we managed better. It meant we worked through better. We dealt with better. We handled better. We stayed on top of, and we felt in control more because we also had another person who had birth skills who was helping us to feel in control. We didn't perceive of what generations before us perceived, which was we suffered in childbirth, which was never about a risk. It was always about our lack of skills. And we also talked about what they did or didn't do. We didn't always like what they did or didn't do to us. And we always told a story about what we felt. We had pain in our legs, we had pain in our back, we pushed for hours, our labor went on and on. It was really quick. We thought we was going to die. But almost all of this, multiple millions of women, when we told our birth stories in 1970s, we told it basically from skills and how our partner helped us. So this is important for you to hear, and it's important for our trust to tell you, because back in the 70s, we would talk about the timing, when things happened, when didn't. We'd talk about the skills we used to cope and work around the assessments, monitoring procedures. We talk about how our partner helped us to cope, and we talked about the discomforts we had. And in my generation, very few women were left with the sense of shame, blame, guilt, and birth trauma that is just explosive now. We had no choices. So we went into hospitals in the United States, and that was the standards of care that we had, and we worked around it with skills. By the 1980s, and increasingly now with the birth plans and the lack of skills, women have a higher expectation of what they want and don't want. They spend hours and hours and hours researching the pros and cons and making decisions and fighting with the medical profession about it. And they tell birth stories that are either wonderful, in which people are only supposed to listen to the wonderful ones, or they're very negative and they leave a scar for life. We have to change this. How do we change this? We change it because of you. If you are pregnant now and you are watching this video, it is important that you become skilled. There are a number of skills-based methods now. Lamaze and Bradley were the beginning ones, and Grantley Dick Reed. They were sort of like the beginning of anything. They weren't evolved. They weren't sophisticated. And sadly, they focused on only women who were having low-risk pregnancies and childbirth in order to achieve very narrow goals: natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical intervention. This was a huge mistake. Had these three wonderful obstetricians had just copped to the truth, 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, 100% of pregnant women will benefit from having skills, we would not be talking about this now, because 100% of women would have become skilled and skills would have evolved. And they would have told their sons and daughters it's normal and natural when you're pregnant to become skilled. And they would have told you, the third generation, that when you're pregnant, it's normal and natural to become skilled and to use those skills no matter where you birth, no matter who's present, no matter your circumstances, no matter what happens to or around you at birth, because you got pregnant to have a baby, not to have a type of birth or a place of birth or a kind of birth. This is your baby's birth. You are going to tell a birth story the rest of your life. And if you tell that birth story, talk about the pride you had in using skills to birth your baby and how your other helped you to do that. So you go out and learn some birth skills. Sure, we'd love you to learn our birth skills because they are the deep evolution of the birth skills that started in the early 1970s, because Birthing Better started in the early 1970s. And they were for all births, because the hundreds of mothers and fathers who developed these skills wanted skills for their baby's birth, whether they were high risk, low risk, home, birth center, hospital, whether they were attached to every hose, or whether this was in the back seat of a taxi. They wanted to tell a birth story about what they did. Now there's hypnobirthing, hypnobabies, calm birth, birthing within, still Lamaze, still Bradley, still Grantley, Dick Reed. Doing things like spinning babies is not a birth skill. It's something you do. Webster technique is not a birth skill. It's something you do. Acupuncture, homeopathics, chiropractor, that is not your skills. Your skills are breathing, relaxation, teamwork. Birthing Better goes further. We develop skills to prepare your pregnant body for birth starting from 24 weeks. Why is that important? Because we discovered in the early 1970s, even when we had skills that were reasonable, we still had the long first and second stages. And those are the ones that tend to have more medical care associated to them. So we found that we could prepare this container, our body, to let this big object out, our baby. And it was simple to do, and it was fun to do, and it worked. So really, we need to change childbirth. I'm not going to have more kids. You're the ones having kids. So you become skilled, and you commit to writing a skills-based birth plan. So your birth provider, whoever it is, knows that you've learned skills. And then you use those skills, no matter how hard it gets, no matter what happens to or around you. This is your baby's birth. Use skills to birth your baby. And then what will you do? When your sons and daughters are older and are going to have kids of their own, you will say to them, it is normal and natural for you to learn skills and use your skills to birth your baby. And then we will have a societal expectation again. That got broken. It got broken because those three obstetricians lost the plot back then, and it got broken because the birth advocates in the 70s and the 80s dismissed skills. Cows and cats aren't taught skills. Women don't need to. Birth is natural. It is natural, and the word natural means anything that could or might happen may happen, whether you like it or not. And when you have skills to do anything in your life, the more challenging it is, the deeper you use those skills and the more empowered you become to your use of being able to cope and manage well. I've promised that I always am going to stop before 20 minutes, so we're now at 18 and a half minutes, and I'm going to stop now. If you have questions, please ask. If you want to become an affiliate, you can. If you're a birth provider, we want to teach you how to tell your clients to choose for themselves. You do not teach them. You do not do it on them. We don't need better birth providers. We need a skilled birthing population. Talk to you again later. Bye-bye.